So if you look at the title is called Stalemate and Attrition. Gray is not the color I usually highlight with, but that'll work for now. Can anyone tell me what stalemate means? Stalemate is when there's two sides and they're not making any ground. So neither side is winning or losing, they're just kind of stuck. And then the word attrition, can anyone tell me what attrition means? Attrition is loss. So the title, like the loss in this instance, the loss of lives. So the title here means that they're stuck, that no side is winning or losing, and that a lot of lives are being lost. And so that's what this article is going to be about. It says, stalemate and attrition are terms inseparable from the memory of the First World War. Because massed, quick-firing artillery and machine guns employed by the thousands gave the defense an unprecedented advantage, both the Allies and the Central Powers found themselves virtual prisoners of their trenches for months on end. Indeed, from the winter of 1914 until the spring of 1918, the trench system seemed fixed, moving now and then a few hundred yards forward or back, on great occasions moving as much as a few miles. Theoretically, it would have been possible to walk from the North Sea beaches all the way to the Alps entirely below ground, but actually the trench system was not absolutely continuous. It was broken here and there, with mere shell holes or fortified strong points serving as connecting links. A little more than half the Allied line was occupied by the French. The rest was British, consisting of about 800 battalions of some 1,000 men each. The two main concentrations of Allied strength were the Ypres salient in Flanders and the Somme area in Picardy. It says, ideally, there were 3 parallel lines of trenches facing the enemy, with the front line trench 50 yards to a mile or so from its hostile counterpart across the way. Several yards behind the front line trench was the support trench, and several yards behind that the reserve. These were the firing trenches, connected by the communication trenches running perpendicular. Saps, shallower trenches, ran out into no man's land, giving access to forward observation and listening posts, as well as grenade, bomb throwing positions and machine gun nests. Coming up to the trenches from the rear, you might walk in a communication trench a mile or more long. It often began in a town and gradually deepened, and by the time it reached the reserve trench, it would be 8 feet deep. Into the sides of the trenches were dug funk holes, where 1 or 2 men would crouch when shelling became particularly heavy. There were also deep dugouts, reached by crude stairways, used as officers' quarters and command posts. The floor of a well-constructed trench was covered with wooden duck boards, because the bottom of a trench was usually wet, and the walls, always crumbling, had to be reinforced by sandbags, corrugated iron, or bundles of reeds. A trench was protected on the enemy side by the copious entanglements of barbed wire, placed far enough out to prevent the enemies crawling up to grenade-throwing range. The normal way of using trenches was for a unit to occupy the front trench for a week or so, then, replaced by fresh men from the rear, to move back to the support trench, and so, after another week, to the reserve. Then, perhaps a few days in a battered town way back, and then the sequence all over again. So a day in a frontline trench began about an hour before first light, say 4:30. This was the moment for the invariable ritual of morning stand to, when everyone stared across no man's land, weapon ready and prepared to repel attack. After the dawn danger had passed, the men stood down and prepared breakfast in small groups, frying bacon and heating tea over small, preferably smokeless, fires. In British trenches, the daily rum ration of about 2 tablespoons was then doled out to each man. Before attacking, when the troops would have to climb out of the trenches on ladders and cross no man's land, larger doses would be vouchsafed. One medical officer deposed after the war was over, "Had it not been for the rum ration, I do not think we should have won the war." During the day, everyone stayed below the top of the trench and cleaned weapons or repaired those parts of the trench damaged by the night's artillery fire. But when nighttime came, the real work began. Wiring parties went out in front to repair the wire and to install new entanglements. Digging parties went forward in SAPs to extend them. Carrying parties negotiated the communication trenches, bringing up rations and ammunition and mail. All this night work was likely to be illuminated suddenly by enemy flares, and it was often interrupted by machine gun artillery fire. But now and then, trench routine would be dramatically violated by an attempt at a large-scale advance. Most of these proved futile and disastrous, none more so than the Battle of the Somme, which the British fought from July to November 1916. Planned meticulously for over 6 months, new railway lines were laid, masses of ammunition and supplies were laid in, a 7-to-1 superiority in troops was assured. The German lines were deluged with a full week's artillery fire from over 1,500 guns. The Somme attack had every reason to succeed. At 7:30 on the morning of July 1st, 1916, the attacking waves of 11 British divisions left their trenches and, filled with hope, began walking, their rifles at port arms, toward the German trenches. A minute later, the machine gun units of the 6 German divisions facing them carried their weapons upstairs from their deep dugouts and simply hosed down the attackers. One astonished German machine gunner recalled, "We were very surprised to see them walking. We had never seen that before. When we started firing, we just had to load and reload. They went down in their hundreds. You didn't have to aim. We just fired into them." Of the 110,000 who attacked, 60,000 were killed or wounded before the day was over. More than 20,000 lay dead between the lines, and it was days before the wounded in no man's land stopped crying out. The failure of the attack seemed to encapsulate all the bizarre anomalies and frustrations of the First World War. Trying to make sense of the events of July 1st, 1916, Edmund Blunden concluded that the stalemate was hopeless, the war ridiculously static, triumphal breakthrough impossible. By the end of the day, he wrote, both sides had seen in a sad scrawl of broken earth and murdered men the answer to the question: no road, no thoroughfare. Neither race had won, nor could win the war. The war had won and would go on winning.